Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Audrey Lichter, Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, a resource center for Jewish engagement. Scholar Circle is one of our programs. Today's Scholar Circle topic is Part 6, Tying It All Together, Anti-Zionism, a Holistic Ideology, with Adam Louis-Klein. This lecture is the last part of Anti-Zionism, the History of an Ideology, a special 6-part series hosted by Chai Mitzvah. The series examines the historical origins, evolution, and contemporary manifestations of anti-Zionism. The series is sponsored by the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism. The other 5 recorded parts can be found on our website at joinscholarcircle.org. In addition to our work at Scholar Circle, Chai Mitzvah's mission is to increase Jewish engagement through small group learning. We have over 20 discussion guides geared towards meaningful and intimate conversations around Jewish text. We especially like to work with synagogues, JCCs, and federations. To date, over 9,000 people have participated in our programs, and we have worked with over 700 legacy organizations. Please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org and contact us to learn more about how to reignite your Jewish learning and increase engagement in these important organizations. Please go to chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea, our founder and board president, who authored the best-selling book Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right political spectrum. Scholar Circle has engaged over 5,000 participants since 10/7 from around the world. The Scholar Circle program hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email as well within 1 week. Thank you to all of our recent donors and also to our annual sponsor, the University of Connecticut, through their Laboratory for the Study and Prevention of Global Antisemitism. We welcome audience questions anytime. Please use the Zoom Q&A box. Scholar Circle is a program of Chai Mitzvah, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Please consider supporting Scholar Circle with a donation, which is fully tax deductible. We now welcome Dr. Andrew Pessin to introduce our esteemed scholar. Andrew?
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Chai Mitzvah. You know, Chai Mitzvah has been doing wonderful work for many years. I've done some of their material with my kids along the way. Please give them some money, send them a few dollars, and to help them keep going and keep doing the great work they've been doing. And indeed, since October 7th, they really stepped to the plate, creating the Scholar Circle, bringing so many important lecturers to people. So absolutely send them a few dollars, please. I am Andrew Pessin. I am the founding director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism, which is a scholarly enterprise to produce, promote, and distribute critical scholarship on this ideology, anti-Zionism, that has, in my view, caused so much damage to the academy and so much damage to the status of Jews and Israel on our campuses and beyond. We're off to a terrific start. Please follow us. Best way to do that is check out our Substack. That's icsa.substack.com. And follow our work and join the wave, as we say. It is my great pleasure to introduce Adam Louis-Klein tonight. You know, every once in a while, you discover someone on social media and you say to yourself, that person thinks just the way I do, but they're more articulate, more eloquent, they do it better. And so you follow that person. And that was my experience with Adam about a year or so ago. And it's been such a privilege watching him launch his movement against anti-Zionism and develop his ideas and his thoughts on social media and beyond. Adam is a scholar of anti-Zionism whose work focuses on anti-Zionism as a single holistic ideology of anti-Jewish exclusion. We'll find out more about what that means in this lecture. Trained in anthropology and philosophy, he combines intellectual history, discourse analysis, and comparative ethnography to examine how anti-Zionist libels, the 3 main ones being colonizer, apartheid, and genocide, operate across numerous domains, including Soviet, Middle Eastern, and Western contexts. His research explores how contemporary moral and human rights language has been repurposed to legitimize the stigmatization and targeting of Jews, Israelis, and Zionists. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Adam.
All right. Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I take it you can see my screen. That's all good.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. So today, I really want to focus on this element of how do you create a field around something, right? How do you create the study of something? You have to actually have an object, a thing that you're studying, right? And you have to be able to construct this object. So the object you're dealing with, your understanding of it is not necessarily given, right? So when, for example, psychoanalysis evolved as a field, they needed a core concept and a core object, right? And so Freud develops the notion of the unconscious. He didn't make it up out of nowhere. He was dealing with phenomena and he was able to synthesize it into an object that then he could continue to study and analyze and develop a rich field of understanding. It's the same thing in the physical sciences, right? How did quantum physics emerge? There were sort of strange phenomena where a particle seems to be in two places at the same time. It wasn't really graspable within the frameworks that currently existed. And so they needed to develop new concepts and define the object at play. So they defined what is a quantum field. They developed concepts like superposition, right? So since October 7th, I feel that we've found ourselves in a situation in which we are dealing with a new phenomenon. At least it feels new to us at the scale and intensity in which it's flooding the West and which it's basically taking control of our whole society, capturing institutions. But my contention is that the frameworks we're using are not working, right? So in order to understand this phenomenon, we need a field, we need to define the object. And so my goal is to convince you that anti-Zionism is something. It's a thing, it's a phenomenon. So I'm going to walk through some core concepts to define the structure of this phenomenon. We're going to talk about libels, which are the unfalsifiable accusations that constitute anti-Zionism. We're going to talk about genealogy. So key to this, and this is a method that I think organically evolved in certain thinkers who were looking at anti-Zionism already. So Isabella Tabarovsky's work on Soviet anti-Zionism showing that there was a source, right, to the anti-Zionist claims we hear today, like Zionism is racism, Zionism is Nazism, etc. She showed you could trace that back to Soviet anti-Zionism, and Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour's work as well, who's been doing a kind of intellectual genealogy of Islamism and Arab nationalism, and who also spoke in this series. We'll talk about the structure. I think that anti-Zionism can be broken down into core elements. And when you break it down to core elements, you can see how they fit together, and you can see the core narrative meme or symbolic logic that anti-Zionism is, and behavior. That has to do with how anti-Zionism is put into practice, how it functions, what is the targeting mechanism through which anti-Zionism harms Jews, right? There's obviously been a lot of debate and confusion about this because people say, well, anti-Zionism is just a criticism of Zionism, or it's a criticism of Israeli policy. Others say, well, actually, deep down, you hate Jews. So we want to understand how exactly does anti-Zionism harm Jews and how does it target? So the five takeaways, right, by the end of this, you're going to understand that anti-Zionism is a thing, an apple, a really existing phenomenon. You're going to understand that across the history of anti-Zionism, we really do get these three core libels: colonizer, apartheid, genocide. That there are three core genealogical sources of anti-Zionism. They are the Nazi Islamist axis, which Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour was talking about. There's Soviet propaganda, which Naya Lecht was talking about in her lecture. And there's Western settler-colonial theory, especially since the 2000s, the academic framework that is now dominating the university. And it's not derived from pre-1948 Jewish tendencies, Jewish debates, critiques of Zionism, as is sometimes claimed today. When we're clear about the history of where it actually comes from, we know where it doesn't come from, and we can put aside those tokenizing claims. Anti-Zionism is distinct from classical anti-Semitism. Our current frameworks and understanding of 19th century European anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust do not grasp anti-Zionism. That is one of my central claims. It has a different set of stereotypes. And in order to combat it, we also need to actually take up this framework. So this framework has not only theoretical implications, it has pragmatic ones, right? We need anti-Zionism studies to understand it. And in order to fight it, we also have to treat it as a distinct phenomenon. So this is just some broad historical context, a model that was used by Jonathan Sachs, by Robert Wistrich, and many others to contextualize anti-Zionism within the history of Jew hatred. There's anti-Judaism against Jews as a religion, anti-Semitism against Jews as a kind of infiltrating race, and anti-Zionism as against Israel, Israelis, and Jews as white colonizers. I think it's important to give this context, but I also want you to forget this diagram, essentially, because you're seeing the whole history of 2,000 years of Jew hatred, but exactly what we need to do actually is zoom in and zoom in on the third one. So anti-Zionism is one thing. It's like an apple, right? So there's a lot of debate, right, in the public sphere about, and when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? Is anti-Zionism a criticism of Israel? So let's just read this and think about whether this sounds like political criticism and whether this sounds like debate around someone's opinions about a state's actions. We should purge and murder Zionists because they're evil white settler, colonizer, genocider, baby-killing agents of apartheid who prop up Israel, a synthetic, bloodthirsty, racist, supremacist ethno-state that deserves to be annihilated. Okay, so that doesn't sound like criticism. It's also not classical anti-Semitism. It's not about money-grubbing Jews controlling the banks and media, right? So we have a different phenomenon that we're dealing with. Neither anti-Semitism in that sense, nor criticism. So as I mentioned before, when we can identify the core historical sources of anti-Zionism, we can clearly distinguish it from opposition to Zionism that existed pre-1948, especially amongst Jews. Zionism was a really existing thing. It was a political movement. It emerged, it was influenced by European nationalism of the 19th century, while it was also connected to ancient strivings to return to Zion. There was a debate about whether it was the right time, whether you could. There were liberal strands of Jewish anti-Zionism that rejected returning to Israel, seeking to assimilate into modern nation states. There were ultra-Orthodox Haredim. They basically believed that you could not return to Israel until the Messiah had arrived. And then there were Jews who were throwing in their lot with Marxism and with the notion of an international working class revolution. Now, it's really only the Marxist ones that become a kind of source, not because of anything Jewish in them, but because of the specifically Soviet element that reconstructs Zionism as bourgeois nationalism, right? That it was a kind of nationalism that was an agent of capitalist and imperialist powers. This was Lenin in his texts against Zionism. Within the 1910s and the 1910s, he wrote a number of texts claiming Zionism was chauvinism, and these would eventually be repurposed to create the notion that Zionism was some kind of imperial racist force. So we see that anti-Zionism does not come from Jewish tradition, from Jewish theology in any way. It comes from a confluence of Nazi, Arab, Soviet propaganda and the streamlining of those propaganda traditions into Western academic settler-colonial theory, particularly around the 2000s, constructing Israel as an inherently genocidal state. So let's look at the content of these three libels. The colonizer libel casts Israel as a hyper-white colonizing race, not a non-white infiltrator into your nation, as in classical anti-Semitism, but the opposite, erasing Jewish indigeneity, history, and diversity. It reframes the expulsion or killing of Israelis of all backgrounds as decolonial virtue. The apartheid libel defames Israel as a uniquely abhorrent apartheid system, ignores the ethno-supremacy that purged nearly all Jews from MENA countries, depicts a one-state reality solvable only by dissolving Israel entirely. Importantly, too, the apartheid libel appropriates the moral prestige of the struggle against apartheid South Africa in order to legitimize what is in fact a genocidal movement to annihilate a whole country and a whole people. A national group such as Israelis are actually protected under the Genocide Convention, even on the basis of shared citizenship. So it uses the euphemism of dismantling apartheid and the appropriation of the moral prestige of the apartheid struggle to legitimize genocide. Anti-Zionism has its own accusation in a mirror or projection structure where it is trying to legitimize genocide of a people, and it does this by accusing Israel of genocide, not as a discrete act that was taken, defined by intent, as in the legal definition of genocide or specific individuals or institutions. It's a standing accusation against Israel that has existed across the history of anti-Zionism. It's genocide libel tags anyone who opposes the destruction of Israel as a genocide supporter by equating Israel's existence with genocide. As we've seen since October 7th, it's wielded to purge Jews and allies from social, cultural, and professional spaces who are seen as embodying the greatest evil of our time, the crime of crimes, which is genocide under international law. Okay, so I talked about the elements. So when we look at these three core elements, right, we can actually decompose them even further. So we have a kind of whole domain of accusations that we can study. We can look at these texts, right? We can look at the propaganda documents, the radio broadcasts. We can look at scholarly texts, and we can trace how all of these different libels, these sub-libels here, as you can see in these different families, have moved across time. So this is my synthetic model. You'll see that the three libels are articulated together, right? So they form a kind of narrative meme. So white colonizers come to Israel. They don't come from Israel originally. They're just Europeans who read the Bible and invented the notion that they come from Israel. This is the anti-Zionist narrative that Jews are just a religion. You'll see this in the PLO charter. You'll see this in Fayez Sayegh from 1965. You'll see this in Patrick Wolf as well. You'll see this in JVP. Repeatedly, Jews are just a religion, not a nation. So they had to invent the notion that they came from Israel to colonize this land. So that's the colonizer libel. And because they didn't really come from there, they had to have a supremacist and racist conception to believe that they could steal it from the native indigenous Palestinians. And this is the apartheid libel. So they went, in order to set up their state as ontologically foreign, that's the word, that's the terms that Fayez Sayegh also used from 1965, they had to set up a segregational and a racist apartheid state. And then eventually, in order to appropriate the land, right, because according to settler-colonial theory, they're not there for the resources, they're there for the land. They had to remove the native population. So ultimately, that racist project results in genocide. So that's the articulation of the libels. And here are sort of the sub-libels that are connected to it. So the colonizer libel is connected to white coding. It's connected to the notion that Jews are actually white Europeans, cultural appropriation, that they've actually stolen culture from the Arabs. For example, the Israelis have a fake culture. You might hear this sometimes that that hummus, they claim hummus is an Israeli food, but actually they stole it from the Arabs, and Israelis don't have any of their own actual cuisine, denies the indigeneity of Jews. You have the Khazar theory, the notion that Jews are all European converts from a medieval Turkic kingdom. The apartheid libel is connected to Zionism as racism. It comes from anti-Judaic traditions of Jews being the chosen people, believing that they are superior to other people. And of course, the genocide libel is connected to Holocaust inversion, treating Israelis as Nazis. So something the Soviets were very good at. Joshua conquest, that's kind of a deep cut, but it's a theory that Israelis believe that they are literally commanded to commit genocide of Palestinians, like Joshua was commanded to exterminate the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible. And so I've connected also the three forms of Jew hatred across history to these three libels, as you can see. So the colonizer libel is most closely related to anti-Semitic materials. So the anti-Semitic concept of Jews in Nazi Germany, for example, was that Jews were an Asiatic horde. They were invading from the east, connected to the Judeo-Bolshevik libel. The Jews were behind communism. So it's rooted in the notion that Jews are invasive foreigners. Now, this essentially, when it's exported to the Arab world, as of course Jeffrey Herf's work has taught us so much about, it becomes the notion that Jews are foreign now to the Arab world. So it's inverted, but it's the same kind of anti-Semitic construction of Jews as foreigners. Anti-Judaism, as I mentioned, is really the core source of the apartheid libel. It's always rooted in notions of chosenness, that Jews believe that they are superior. And the genocide libel is really, there are sort of earlier forms that were seeded by Nazi Arab propaganda, that the Zionists were trying to commit genocide against Arabs during World War II, and that was actually used to try and incite violence against Jews, such as we saw in the Farhud, for example, in 1941, incited by Hajamin al-Husseini, who worked with the Nazis, the Mufti of Jerusalem. But as a whole, this whole Holocaust inversion complex is a post-Holocaust phenomenon and one of anti-Zionism's most innovative contributions. So here is my integrative historical model, right? So this is the historical process through which these three libels came to be articulated across these different phases. And this integrates and synthesizes the work of so many scholars, and some of who spoke at this series. So the Nazi Islamist axis, again, that Jeffrey Herf has told us about, the Soviet propaganda that Naya liked discussed, and I've identified a transitional form, which is secular Christian Arab nationalism. So the Mufti, for example, was more of a pan-Islamist. He wanted to unite all Muslims everywhere. Secular Christian Arab nationalism emerges as a more powerful force in the 50s and the 60s. So Arab nationalism under Nasser. But when I talk about secular Christian, I'm really talking about figures like Michel Aflaq, who was the sort of intellectual founder of the Ba'athist movement, or Constantine Zurich, who actually coined the term Nakba, and Fayez Sayegh, who I've alluded to already, who was a PLO propagandist, and of course Edward Said was an Arab Christian, and they were many of the instrumental figures in Arab nationalism were Christians, and they repurposed a lot of these Christian anti-Judaic supersessional materials to say that Zionism was a kind of bad particularism in the face of universal rights, human rights, etc. And so I see that as a kind of transition where the Soviet propaganda emerges more in collaboration with secular Arab nationalism than it does with Islamism. Now, Soviet propaganda is ultimately in the late 20th century and into the 2000s is going to enter into Western settler colonial theory, but we have a transitional period in the 80s and the 90s where Edward Said makes a splash in the Western elite academies like Princeton and Georgetown with his concept of Orientalism. So he begins to get in the colonizer libel into the West, whereas it wasn't mainstream in the West before that by framing Zionism as colonialism. But it's not fully the Western settler colonial model. Now, Western settler colonialism flows back into the Nazi Islamist axis today in the Islamization of the Palestinian complex, which starts in the 2000s with the rise of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood in Qatar. And so these Islamist elements are maintaining a lot of that Nazi anti-Jewish ideology, but they are now also incorporating Western settler colonial theory. So if you look at, for example, Hamas's Our Narrative, which they produced in 2024 in English, it sounds almost identical to Western settler colonial theory. So Israel is an inherently settler colonial genocidal state. They basically reincorporate that. So they are now also using Western settler colonial theory. So all the elements become linked in this way. So we're nearing the end. I've given you quite a lot because I wanted to show how it all fits together. But here you can see again that we should distinguish anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism insofar as anti-Semitism, right, constructs Jews as a non-white race that pollutes and undermines one's own society. Anti-Zionism constructs Jews as a hyper-white colonizing super race, invading someone else's society. And this is the problem we are actually dealing with on the ground, right? So all of the hatred and harassment and discrimination that we're seeing in universities, in workplaces, in the arts, everywhere across society, the vast majority of it is anti-Zionist and not classically anti-Semitic. And this is the main problem we're dealing with, is that the public discourse, as well as the models we're using when we go to administrations and we ask them to stop this, are all based on the classical anti-Semitic frame. They're looking for anti-Semitism in the broad sense when people are called non-white communist hook-nosed bankers. They're not looking for it, or they don't understand it when people are being abused as white genocidal colonizer baby-killing Zion Nazis. But that slur, right? So we've looked at at the intellectual roots, we've looked at the historical roots, we've looked at the structure, right? But this is how it's manifesting, right? Day to day. People are being called these slurs. Those slurs have a history and a structure. I may just skip to the end because we're running out of time. Um, and so here we can see the behavior, right? The slurs, the marking of people as Zionists, the tagging them in this way in ways that demonize them and legitimize violence against them based on this integrative ideology and set of libels. And this functions today in progressive society because it's adapted itself to the language of the left and of human rights, right? That was the Soviet Union's genius move, and the Western academics' genius move was to now give it legitimacy and authority within the West after the Cold War. So if you wanted to purge Jews from the West with the permission of tolerant progressive society, how would you do it? You would take the most hated evils of the age, whiteness, supremacy, colonialism, racism, apartheid, genocide, and project them onto Jews under the substitute label Zionist, regardless of accuracy. You would repeat the libels until they harden into self-evident truths, training the culture to see Jews not as people, but as moral contaminants. Then your anti-Zionist movement could remove Jews from public life with the full cooperation of progressive society. So unfortunately, that's what we're seeing happening every day. The only way to stop it is to start naming anti-Zionism, building a discourse on anti-Zionism, and setting boundaries on anti-Zionism. So those are the takeaways, and that is it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Hang on a second. There we go. Thank you, Adam. That was a real treat. We'll give a moment for questions to please put them in the Q&A box, should be on the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, look in the more circle dot dot dot, and then you should be able to find it in there. Zoom has moved things around. So a couple of questions just to start right away, which is first, where could people, I think you put up some resources right at the end quickly there, but where can people find your writings most readily to find written versions of what you just said so they can process it and digest it more thoroughly?
Yeah, well, you can just go to my website, adamlouisklein.com, and then it has a list of the places I've written at, like the Free Press and Sapir, and those articles are probably the best way in.
Okay, wonderful. Also, I think a pretty obvious question would be this one. Uh, Distinguishing anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism, as you suggest that we do, does that not play into the hands of the haters? Because after all, this is what they've been proclaiming. We're not anti-Semites. They proclaim they're against anti-Semitism. They hate the Nazis, right, etc. They're only anti-Zionist. So are we giving them something that helps them when we distinguish them?
No, I think we're actually meeting them where they're at and disrupting their entire game, right? Because it all depends on them saying, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist, and relying on us to anchor everything in anti-Semitism, which is always conflated with classical anti-Semitism, right? So it relies on us to only get them if we can show they're classical anti-Semites. You know, it will only get to object to the keffiyeh-clad activists chanting for resistance against white colonizers if we can find somewhere that they drew a swastika somewhere, right? But we're never going to find that actually because that person really doesn't think they're a Nazi and really wouldn't draw a swastika somewhere, right? The moment we say, okay, fine, you can say that, but anti-Zionism itself is bad. Look at the history. It has an ugly history. Look at what it does, right?
Yeah,
I reject anti-Zionism, they have nowhere to go, right? They depend on us actually legitimizing anti-Zionism by saying, well, it's not enough to be anti-Zionist to be something bad. You have to be anti-Semitic.
right. So, you mentioned the example of the swastika, which is fascinating because the swastika now has a dual meaning. It used to be it's an assertion of a Nazi idea, like a threat to the Jews. But of course, part of the anti-Zionist libels, as you mentioned in passing, is that Israel are the Nazis, right? Israelis are the Nazis, etc. So sometimes the swastika can represent the charge against Zionists that they're Nazis as opposed to a threat to Jews. So that way, I think some of the progressives on campus might be drawing some of those swastikas, right? But they're doing it as an accusation rather than as a threat.
Right, and you can see that actually sometimes people who are looking from the outside and are trying to view this as anti-Semitic actually make that mistake.
Yeah,
But I have seen that people say, well, they drew swastikas, right? And then you look at what they did, right? And they were drawing the swastika inside the Israeli flag, right? They didn't mean, I'm a
yeah,
Nazi attacking you, but Israel itself is Nazism, right? And that's part of the inversion pattern of anti-Zionism. It inverts anti-Semitism in that way, and it also projects one's own sort of racism onto Israel by saying Israel's racist and genocidal.
Right. There's a question here about um, currently with this new strategy. I think it would be useful in a moment if you say a little more about how we fight it. I think all you've really said concretely is we have to first name it, which of course is obvious, right? Yes, we have to first name it and identify it. So there will be a question: how exactly do we fight back, especially on our campuses, to dismantle the anti-Zionism there? But one of the challenges of distinguishing anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism, as you do, is that the legal architecture we all have is all expressed in terms of anti-Semitism. If there's a legal case, it's about anti-Semitism. The IRA definition is supposed to be about anti-Semitism. So if we start changing the language to anti-Zionism, are we just sort of jettisoning whatever we've built up, whatever successes it's had, which is all framed in terms of anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that legal framework just isn't working, right? Right. And if you look at the legal cases that have been made since October 7th, it's a very patchy record. So we have won some. So we won the Brandeis Center won the UC Berkeley case showing the anti-Zionists were discriminating against Jews on campuses by excluding Zionists, right, from their student groups. But we lost the Stand With Us versus MIT, where the judge basically said, well, you can't ever really know if anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's usually just political critique. You can't assume this, right? So I don't think that that model is working very well because it asks people to map anti-Zionism onto anti-Semitism and the protected. So the way I would address this, right, some of the lawyers want to do it this way, that the protected category is Jews, and you can understand that as religion or national or whatever. And when people are targeting Zionists, right, it's because Zionism is a part of Judaism, at least for most Jews, it's a deeply held belief. They're targeting Jews and they can't do that. Now, I think that's not a very convincing argument, right? If there are anti-Zionist Jews, right, it's clear that Zionism doesn't look like an inherent part of Judaism for a third party observer. And if your only claim is that this is my deeply held belief, someone could just say, well, I have free speech to question your deeply held beliefs, right? So it doesn't actually get at the problem. The way I would do this is you have to actually shift it. What is the protected category? It's Israelis. It's Israelis as a national group, and Israelis are a protected category. But when we're always trying to map it onto anti-Semitism, we're saying, oh, you only hate Israelis because you hate Jews. Right? So again, it's only bad if it's because you hate Jews. Well, actually, hating Israelis is wrong in itself. Now, of course, anti-Zionism does target Jews, but the proxy relation now is reversed. Right? So either you can understand it that targeting Zionists and Israelis is a proxy for targeting Jews, or targeting um, Zionists or Jews become a proxy for Israelis. So that's how I'd structure it legally, and I think it's actually more accurate to how anti-Zionists think. So they hate Israel, and then they project their hatred of Israel onto Jews marked as Zionists who are seen as insufficiently separate from Israel.
Right. So Zionist is the fundamental category. And it's always struck me with the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Like, it's pretty clear that discrimination on the basis of national origin is a problem. It's like illegal, generally speaking. And BDS is openly discrimination on the basis of national origin. Why has it been allowed? How has it taken root, like in all the places, campus and beyond, when it's so openly discriminatory? Do you have any thoughts on how that could happen?
It's exactly through this process. It's the problem with the framework we're currently using. It's always an attempt to say BDS is anti-Semitic. You are boycotting Israel and obviously discriminating against Israelis because you don't like Jews, and not enough emphasis on the actual discriminatory character of these boycotts against Israelis.
Well,
Right?
I
That's
think
anti-Israeli discrimination.
this point was a way of questioning how hopeful we should be about this shift, because we've already have a clear movement that discriminates against Israelis on the basis of national origin, namely the entire BDS movement, and that hasn't stopped anything, right? And so if we shift to making Zionist the protected category or Israeli the protected category, haven't we been doing that in fighting the BDS movement and basically failed because it just, spreads like a virus?
Well, if you see that the BDS has actually had a lot of trouble, getting in their actual resolutions, at the highest levels of universities. So you have universities who will accept, violent anti-Zionist protests on campus that harass Jewish students, but they often do actually draw the line at BDS. Now that could change if the anti-Zionist hate movement in general continues to grow, right? But we haven't been able to do anything really about anti-Zionist harassment and bullying and discrimination of Jews on campuses, right? And I think that will change once it's not just the legal kind of hack, it's also making the broader cultural argument and getting people to see anti-Zionism as something. So anti-Israeli discrimination is a formal category, but you need more than that. You need people to see anti-Zionism as a whole,
Right.
as a
Okay.
hate. Yeah.
Question comes up. You, I think, addressed it in passing, but it'd be worth dwelling on in a moment. The hyphen. So, can you explain a little bit about why you're stressing dropping the hyphen, or the distinction you make between the use of the hyphen and not the hyphen in
Right.
anti-Zionism?
Right. So it's fairly standard actually within contemporary anti-Semitism studies. David Hirsch has been doing it for a while, not to have to get rid of the hyphen. But I think it's really important because, if anti-Zionism is just opposition to Zionism, if it's debate with Zionism, and that's how it's presented in the public discourse a lot of the time, they're Zionists, they're anti-Zionists, they're debating about Israel's actions or even Israel's nature as a state. It's also clear when it's framed that way why anyone could just say this is criticism or people should be allowed to say this, it's not hate, because it's framed as two belief systems that are being opposed. And when we talk about anti-Semitism, we just say, oh, you're a hidden anti-Semite behind your belief
Mhm.
against Zionism. That doesn't capture anti-Zionism as its own bigotry, as its own hate movement. So when we remove the hyphen, we see that anti-Zionism is not some kind of conversation with Zionism. It's a hate movement that constructs and imagines its own concept of the Zionist.
Interesting. There's a question, that quote you had at the beginning, it was a long quote which packed all the allegations in. Was that a real quote, or is it just like an amalgamation of all the things they say? They're baby killing, ethnocentric, whatever. You packed them all into one quote. Was that an amalgamation or a real
That
quote?
was not a literal real quote, but I
Okay.
could definitely find in my DMs people harassing me with pretty long stuff, which has basically everything in it.
Yeah, no, they do tend to pack them all in. Okay.
Yeah.
Some different kinds of questions here. Recently, I've seen the emergence on social media of traditional Catholics claiming their anti-Zionism is based on theological arguments. I would love to hear your comments on this.
Yeah, so like I said, anti-Zionism has anti-Judaic elements. It has elements that came from classical anti-Semitism as well, and it can also resonate with these older forms of Jew hatred. I'd say especially the anti-Judaism. I think anti-Zionism is kind of polarized with classical anti-Semitism. You do have some crossovers, but they have different logics. Anti-Judaism is very similar, right? In both anti-Judaism and anti-Zionism, they're saying we don't oppose the people themselves. We oppose this belief system that we are superseding, and our own belief system is fundamentally opposed to it, right? So the anti-Judaic element, right? We're seeing supersessionism come back basically. So Catholics are saying, well, it's incompatible, right, with our religion, that Israel should exist as a Jewish state. Israel's kind of the covenant with God, right, that gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people has been superseded, right? And that core notion is part of the supersessionism of anti-Zionism. Jews can't go back to Israel because that covenant was broken. Jews don't have that claim. And I think that's implicit in a lot of anti-Zionism.
Much of what you're saying seems to be targeted towards the left wing, the progressive, at least in the academic context. Although you did interestingly point out, like this language, settler-colonial language, anti-colonialism is now being adopted by what are not left-wing groups like Hamas. But nevertheless, at least as it manifests on campuses, it's a left-wing phenomenon. Do you think that the rise of this progressive anti-Zionism has given a permission structure for the right wing to sort of come back out of the woodwork? For a while, they were pretty marginalized and peripheral, right wing anti-Semitism, let's say. So, do you think the left wing has normalized this kind of discourse that's allowed, for example, Catholic supersessionism to sort of start recovering, coming back?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. When a new form of Jew hatred emerges, it'll distinguish itself from the old one, but eventually act as a permission structure for it. So when Wilhelm Marr came up with the term anti-Semitism in 1879, he said he wasn't a religious Jew hater, right? He was doing something better and more scientific, right? But by the time you have Der Stürmer in the 20s and 30s, right? If you look at those
That's the
documents by
Nazi propaganda newspaper. Yeah.
Nazi propaganda newspaper. They actually revived all of the medieval anti-Judaic libels. They had the Judensau, where the Jews are sucking from a pig. They had images of Jews killing children from the Middle Ages, right? So it becomes an encompassing permission structure to bring back the older forms of Jew hatred. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing. So we are seeing classical anti-Semitism and medieval anti-Talmudic libels coming back with full force, but they're done within the overall more acceptable form of anti-Zionism. And it's anti-Zionism that's going to be the way that's expressed, right, in the kind of mainstream public. It's going to be more kooky figures who are using the older forms.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In fact, there was a lecturer at University College London a few months back who basically she was talking about the famous Damascus blood libel case from 1840, and she asserted it affirmatively that Jews, in fact, use blood for ritual purposes, etc., right? The
Mm.
classic medieval blood libel is back, at least in certain circumstances, and one imagines that what allows her to say that is just this overarching anti-Zionism, which, as you sometimes, it codes the Jews as the most evil phenomenon there is. It allows you to say anything horrible about the Jews. So it really does open the door to previous forms of the Jew hatred, which is horrifically scary because you think they're in the past and they're not, right? They're just waiting to come back out. All right, can you please address how organizations such as JVP, which is Jewish Voice for Peace, and Jews for Palestinian Liberation fit into your model? Are they merely today's Yevsektia, or is there more to it? Maybe you can explain what that term means.
Yeah, the Yevsektia basically was a group of Jewish Bundists who were the Bund were basically a diasporist organization. They rejected Zionism because they wanted a basically Yiddish kind of autonomous Yiddish language culture within multi-ethnic states like Russia at the time, for example. Now, with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Bund were quickly incorporated into the Communist Party. So Lenin's attacks on Zionism that I had mentioned, right? He also attacked the Bund at the time because he said the Bund were actually too nationalist. Even the Bund, they should also dissolve into the working class, the universal kind of vanguard. So post 1917, the Bund was basically incorporated into the Communist Party, and then they served to basically dismantle Jewish life in the Soviet Union. They outlawed Hebrew. They closed synagogues, all under the pretext that this was a form of Jewish liberation. So they did give a kind of Jewish face to the desecration and destruction of Jewish life under anti-Zionism. And this reappeared later on in the Soviet Union. Right, you had the AXO, Anti-Zionist Committee of the Soviet Public, in the early 80s, right, that was responding to critiques of how the Soviet Union was treating its Jews. They literally handpicked basically a committee largely of Jews to say, we are Jews and we oppose Zionism. So that entire tokenizing method has a history. It exists along the entire life of anti-Zionism, right? So one of the earliest token anti-Zionist documents we have post 1948 is from 1956 when Fayez Sayegh, the PLO propagandist, he was working for the Arab League. He was living in New York at the time. And he produced this radio broadcast where he had one Jew who was a kind of so-called pro-Israel Jew, and then another anti-Zionist Jew from this small token organization called the American Council for Judaism that basically closed down very shortly after the creation of Israel. So he was already doing this to say, look, there's division in the Jewish community, and there are Jews who oppose Zionism, while he himself, of course, was a radical anti-Zionist, truly without the hyphen, and would go on to construct Israel as inherently colonial, apartheid, and genocidal. So this is just a part of anti-Zionism, tokenized. It lives and breathes on tokenism. But to understand that, you got to talk about anti-Zionism, and the classical anti-Semitism model doesn't work very well, right? Because the Nazis ultimately didn't accept tokens. They said every ethnic Jew must be murdered.
Do you think that groups like JVP, like, is the analogy nearly perfect with these earlier groups, or is there any way that they're different? Because at least one thing at least one difference in their function today is they do a tremendous amount of work as Jew washing is the expression, right? They defend anti-Zionism from counting as anti-Semitic because after all, they're anti-Zionists, but they're Jews. So they're playing that function. I don't know if that function occurred in the Soviet context. So I'm curious if you think that's an important difference.
Yeah, I mean, in the Soviet context, they always said they were opposed to anti-Semitism, they were opposed to racism, and of course, they connected all that with fascism and Nazism. Right? So, as a left-wing Jew hatred, they could position anti-Semitism as like fascism and Nazism, and thus inherently on the right. So, anti-Zionism exploits, right, our reliance on only talking about classical anti-Semitism because it's right-coded, and all these people are on the left. So they don't find it credible that they are right wing, that they are right wing and Nazis. So when we call them anti-Semites, right, they exploit the conflation between anti-Semitism in general and anti-Semitism as this classical anti-Semitism. We need our own category of left-wing Jew hatred. It can appear on the right as well, but that kind of Jew hatred whose home is on the left.
Do you think you could reach a JVP person by saying, look at the history of people like you. It doesn't turn out well for you, like in the long run, right? Like you're serving a purpose, you're a useful idiot, etc. But in the end, you go in the ovens along with all the other Jews. Do you think we can reach them that way?
I don't think we can reach them with that because I
Okay.
don't think they don't think of themselves as self-interested, right? They think they're participating in this universal revolution, that they're driven by compassion and solidarity for the oppressed. I think the way you can convince them is say this is an oppression, right? This is a left-wing oppression. There are other left-wing oppressions. Stalinism was a left-wing oppression, right? The Cambodian genocide was a left-wing mass atrocity, right? Just because it's on the left does not give it a pass, right? And so associating it with other cases in which the left did have to recognize that the left did horrible things, and it doesn't mean they have to no longer be on the left. They just have to stop being anti-Zionists.
Interesting. Okay, question. Where does the Protocols of the Elders of Zion fit in your paradigm? I ask after having seen this book for sale at a mass prayer center of Muslims after Ramadan.
Yeah, so I think Richard Landes, who I think gave the
The
first
first
talk,
talk, yeah.
spoke about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and then Andrew, you've also spoken about it a lot. I think it has an important role, right? I think that obviously, again, Isabella Tabarovsky's work showed that the protocols of the Elders of Zion fed into Soviet anti-Zionism. You have conspiratorial themes in Arab nationalist discourse. Sayegh wrote this book, I believe in 1979, about Zionist propaganda in the
In the
United
United
States,
States, yeah, right.
saying that the Zionists control the
Media.
American media and the banks, et cetera. And just like Richard Landis was saying, there was a projection structure involved. He actually says in that book, he says, well, why greatly admire their skill at propaganda? Like, I wish I could be so good at it. Right. And of course, he spent his life as a propagandist. Right. He
Right.
was always a radio broadcaster and in every role that he had. Um, and so there's a conspiratorial dimension. Both classical anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have conspiratorial dimensions, right? They associate Jews with some kind of power structure, with some kind of system of oppression. Um, you have the Greater Israel libel, which is kind of the Greater Israel libel actually comes from this notion that Jews, it's similar to the Joshua conquest libel. The Jews believe they're literally commanded to fulfill the
Yeah.
Bible. Jews are these biblical literalists and fundamentalists, right? And this notion that Jews are trying to expand and take over the world. So that conspiratorial notion now reappears in anti-Zionism in what is a very pure anti-Zionist libel, right? The whole notion of Jews as right-wing messianic biblical fundamentalists is very kind of the stuff of anti-Zionism, but you're seeing a similar conspiratorial undertone to it all.
Yeah, and it's not just that it's conspiratorial. I mean, this goes right back to the protocols. The Jews do plan to literally take over and conquer the entire world. So it's rooted there. And I think, but the conspiratorial part of it is what turns whatever this conflict is in the Middle East into one between good and evil, right? That's what makes the Jews evil because of their conspiracy to control everything. If they didn't have that, they would just be people fighting over a little bit of land. But it's because they're seen as having this incredible power over all things that the other side feels they are battling something evil. So
And I
I
should
think,
say,
yeah.
I should say one more thing on that because in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, there's also the anti-Judaic Jewish supremacy type libel within that same text. So that was incorporated into the classical conspiratorial anti-Semitism of the Protocols. Right? So the
Understood.
notion that Jews think they're the chosen people, and so they're superior to others. Right? So there is a continuity there of that anti-Judaic libel into anti-Semitism, and then that libel appearing in the Arab nationalist kind of
Yeah.
discourse of Jews as Zionism as racism, etc.
And in fact, the connection is even deeper. We all think of the protocols as the fundamental or sort of key anti-Semitic text, but it also is the fundamental key anti-Zionist text. It's not an accident that that book is set at the first Zionist Congress, because what it's opposed to is Jewish power ultimately, which is Zionism. So, I know I'm working to get that a little more centered in people's minds that the protocols is, and you've actually said this in passing that we tend to think of anti-Semitism as the more fundamental category, and then anti-Zionism is like a subset of anti-Semitism. But really, perhaps anti-Zionism is the fundamental category. So that was a passing thought you had once, but I actually think it's a very deep and good thought. Let's go to some more questions here. A person asks, instead of debating semantics, which I assume is how they're characterizing the discussion of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, wouldn't the Jewish community be better served by discussing topics like self-defense and survival?
Yeah, I mean, is it semantics? I'm not really sure what that means. There's a linguistic issue in which there's a conceptual conflation that's happening, right? So there's a single term that's being used to conflate different concepts, and that is acting to minimize and obscure what anti-Zionism is. So the goal is not semantics, it's to be able to see the phenomenon and to talk about it effectively. Right. And the anti-Semitism language and framework's not doing that because it's mapping everything into classical anti-Semitism and making anti-Zionism, which is a really existing thing. It's not semantic, it's an apple that we need to see. Right. But also, you can't do anything with an apple. You can't go buy an apple unless you can also name the apple as well. Right. So language matters. Language and concept and reality, right, are all connected here. Yeah.
So then the second half of that person's question, let's focus on that, which is that was a wonderful response to the first half of the question. Um, Given the, I would say, emergency or dire situation that Jews are in across the globe, including in Israel, should we be emphasizing this sort of intellectual work that you're doing and I'm trying to do and others, or is it time for us just to, get strapped basically and start getting our guns?
Well, we need to do something, and we need to have a social movement, and that's why I started the movement against anti-Zionism, to have a civil rights movement and a civic discourse that speaks back to anti-Zionism in the public, and that's what we need to do. But to have an effective movement, you also want to have your scholars who are learning about it and helping educate people, and you want to understand the phenomenon you're opposing. But also the two things are connected, not because scholarship's being reduced to activism, but they're both doing converging in the central point, right? We need to see anti-Zionism as a phenomenon and name it and fight back against it. So I can see it as a phenomenon and name it and fight back against it when I'm creating all these crazy diagrams to create some mega structure in a scholarly way. And I can also see it and name it and fight back against it when, one is spreading popular memes online or creating slogans like anti-Zionism is a hate movement that anyone can use.
Okay, I think a short one. Neturei Karta, are they anti-hyphen Zionist or anti-Zionist without a hyphen?
Yeah, so
Do you
there's a
mind
few.
explain who the group is quickly, maybe?
Okay, so Neturei Karta is basically a fringe Haredi group that claims that it is kind of being faithful to the Haredi tradition of not allowing Zionism until the Messiah comes back. Now, that would seem to suggest it is anti-Zionist with the hyphen, the legitimate form of anti-Zionism. Now, in our historical era, to be clear, virtually all anti-Zionists with the hyphen are actually anti-Zionists without the hyphen because they participate in this hateful movement. So Neturei Karta like goes and visits the Iranian government and talks about Israel as genocidal and is at these protests, right? An important test, right, is if someone really wants to say that they're the good kind of anti-Zionist with the hyphen, well, will they condemn the anti-Zionist hate movement? And you'll find also that people like Shaul Magid, who's a Harvard professor today, who's claiming that he's in the lineage now of Satmar Hasidism, another Haredi group, right? These kinds of people, they will never, or Peter Beinart, for example, they will never actually condemn the anti-Zionist hate movement as it exists. They frame their own work as justifying that hate movement through tokenism, through saying it's actually just some debate with Zionism and it's a Jewish thing, right? So I think that once you actually make the distinction, you see that it sort of dissolves in the present, if that makes sense, because none of these people will actually condemn, though they won't follow you in that distinction, right? They won't allow that distinction to take place because it would delegitimize the tokenizing move.
Interesting. We're right at the end. There's so many questions we're not going to be able to get to, but let me squeeze one more in if you can give a shorter answer to this one. We've been talking primarily about anti-Zionism on campus and in sort of academic environments, but what about the Democratic Party caving in and using this in the current political zeitgeist? So
Well,
what do
so
we,
what
yeah,
we
yeah,
see, right, is because we don't have a public discourse on anti-Zionism, because we don't have politicians condemning anti-Zionism, because administrators don't understand anti-Zionism as a category, right? Anti-Zionism is just flooding into society. It's like the Al-Aqsa flood, right? It really is just flooding everywhere and it's taking over everything, and there are no dams. Right? There are no dams. So it's coming from the far left, but increasingly it's made its way into the center, and now it's taking over the Democratic Party. Right? So we need to put up those dams and set clear boundaries. But the current framework around criticism of Israel, anti-Semitism, it's never clear what the boundaries are. So we have to say anti-Zionism is wrong. There are some things you can't say about Israel, and they're the anti-Zionist libels, basically. And anti-Zionist libel is also a racist behavior, obsessively spreading inflammatory accusations about Israel, that you presume to be true without counter evidence or anything. That's not okay. This is a behavior that we're identifying, and the Jewish community and our allies are going to say, well, actually, we're going to sandbag this, and we're going to say no. And that's when that flood will stop.
wonderful. So I encourage all people to check out Adam's website and also the Movement Against Anti-Zionism, that website as well. You'll see a lot of the memes are there and a lot of the helpful tips on how to think and how to frame and how to use language around these issues. So with that, I turn it back over to Audrey to wrap up.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Andrew. Um, so much to think about, and so glad, Andrew, that you are beginning your new adventure on ICSA, and we're going to be hearing more from you as we have completed this series that has been so informative. So a lot to think about. This lecture has been recorded and it will be sent to your email along with the resource guide and with information of how to get in touch with Adam. And there were many, many, many questions that we didn't get to. And Adam will be given the questions, and hopefully you'll get some answers as you research some of his work as well. Our next Scholar Circle lecture features Dr. Rachel Fish on Lost in Translation, How Anti-Semitism Gets Misunderstood Outside the Jewish World. Join us for this lecture on Monday, May 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and register at joinscholarcircle.org. That's Monday, May 18th at 7 p.m. with Dr. Rachel Fish. And again, please consider a donation to support our free lectures. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we'll see you on May the 18th.